I would like to welcome you all to today's Holocaust Living History workshop with Dr. Hilda van Neck-Yoder. I'm Suzanne Hillman from, the Holocaust Living History workshop, obviously, the program manager. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to draw your attention to our next event, which will feature Goldie Morgenthaler, a professor of literature at the University of Lethbridge and a translator of Yiddish. Professor Morgenthaler will talk about the work of her mother, Chava Rosenfarb, who was one of the few Yiddish novelists writing fiction about the Holocaust in the 20th century. Before the lecture, we will offer a free screening of a documentary that was recently released about the life and work of Chava Rosenfarb. It's called That Bubble of Being. So if you take a flyer, please note that the screening is going to be here at 3 on May 4th, but the talk will start as usual as 5. So feel free to come to both events or just one of the two. And now to today's event. Over the past decade, the Holocaust has generated a massive amount of scholarship. Yet even 70 years after the conclusion of the war, the Second World War, there are still stories we don't know. There are lives that have disappeared without a trace, and there are places we have never even heard of. In recent years, it seems to me that the effort to reconstruct some of these stories has been taken up by a lot of men and women researching their family history, and we've had a number of them actually speaking at our events. And so the result has been an increasing number of memoirs and histories written by children of victims, grandchildren, siblings, cousins, etc. Their work, I think, is an essential contribution to the study of the Holocaust. And this brings me, in this context, to our speaker. I take a particular pleasure in introducing today's speaker, Hilda van Neck-Yoder. Dr. van Neck-Yoder was born in Holland, in the Netherlands, and has taught comparative literature at Howard University in the Department of English. She has published work in Dutch and Caribbean, or Caribbean Dutch literature, and since her retirement as professor emeritus, she has become a docent at the San Diego Museum of Art, and I'm impressed by the very varied work she has been studying and lecturing on. She has lectured on Japanese woodblock prints, on Rembrandt's interest in Indian painting, and on Asia in 17th century Dutch art. I wish we could hear more about that, but today we'll learn more about her recent work, which has focused on the Holocaust. She has, for some time now, translated letters and conducted research for her Canadian cousin, whose Dutch father lost almost all of his family in the Holocaust. I may also add that Dr. van Neck-Yoder has been one of our most loyal supporters for several years. So please help me welcoming Hilda van Neck-Yoder.
All right, let me turn on my mic. All right, can you hear me? Is it on? No? Is it on now? Better. Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, Suzanne, for inviting me. It's really a tremendous honor to speak to all of you. I want to first of all thank two people that did a lot of work. They helped me tremendously, and the first one is Huddy Haller, and her cousin is here. I met her here, and she works at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and she told me that she would look up anything for me, and she did, and she found some remarkable things that made a big difference in my research. The other person's name is Raymond Schultz. He is a professor at the University in Amsterdam, and he is a specialist in one aspect that I will be discussing. And without his help, I would not have been able to talk to you at all. I wouldn't have been able to develop the kind of interesting story, at least I think it's really an interesting story, that begins with the most unimportant piece of paper, that is a change of address. And here is L. Klerenkoper, his name is Leendert, his family called him Lucky, and He is moving. This is his little note card that he sends to his aunt, announcing to her that he is moving from Westerbork to Vught. So the function of that little card is for her now to write to him and especially to send packages, which he did endlessly. Every letter he writes and thanks her for the package of the 15th and the 17th and the 19th. She sent him many, many packages. To us, it has a completely different function. We're trying to figure out from these little pieces of paper the person that we don't know anything about. We knew his name. My cousin in Canada, Kati, knew his name, but otherwise he was completely forgotten. We don't know what kind of education he had, what kind of person he was. So we have 4 letters that he left, that he wrote to his aunt from Vught, and then we have this little unimportant piece of paper. However, if we place this piece of paper within the historical context, we will make some remarkable discoveries, because you will ask, when you look at this piece of paper, what was he doing in Westerbork? And what was he doing in Vught? What was going on in Vught? Why would anybody from Westerbork go to Vught? And questions like that. So, let me make sure I go the right direction. So, he was in Westerbork, and Westerbork, let me see if I can point it out to you. It's right here in the north. It's in an area of Holland that's absolutely horrible. There's nothing there. There's just sand. There are no people. Of course, on purpose, they put the camp there for the Jewish people that were deported, secret deportations from Westerbork to Auschwitz and Sobibor. All the people were moved from all of Holland to Amsterdam in the spring of 1942, so that they could very easily be deported from Amsterdam on the train to Westerbork. And people would be picked up at night in the dark. There would be a knock on the door, and they would be rounded up, and then the trains would leave at midnight, so no one would see any of these trains with these hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people going at night to Westerbork. And at Westerbork, they would stay a day, a week, a month, sometimes much longer, and then they would be pushed into cars, railroad cars, and sent to Auschwitz. Now, that's where he is. That's where he sends his little note card to his aunt. And these camps, Auschwitz is Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Sobibor, they were not concentration camps. They were really extermination camps. There was nothing there except gas to kill people. So people would arrive, and within a few hours, they would be dead. This is Auschwitz-Birkenau and Sobibor, and the period of time is July 15, 1942 to September 1944. Just to give you statistics to begin with, to set the scene, in that period, over 100,000 Jews were deported on 93 trains, mostly from transit camp Westerbork, as you can see here, to the extermination camps of Auschwitz and Sobibor. They were not sent to labor camps, they were sent to be murdered immediately. There were 2 trains that left from Vught, but practically everybody was in Westerbork, and then the automatic things, you had no choice. There was a prison, it was all, you were a prisoner in Westerbork, and you had no choice. You were pushed on that train on Tuesdays, and the whole camp would be on lockdown. Nobody could leave their barracks, except for the people who would be supposed to go on the train, because otherwise there would be pandemonium, because it was so horrific. Out of the people that were deported, only 5% survived. So that of the 140,000 people whom the Germans considered full Jews living in the Netherlands at that time, between 20 and 25 survived the war. And this is the lowest survival rate of any country in Europe. So how is it possible that Luc Klerenkoper is in Westerbork and is not pushed on one of those trains to Sobibor of Auschwitz? How did that happen? That is a very strange situation. And if we look at Vught, where he was going, what we see is is that he's actually going against traffic, because the people that were imprisoned in Vught, and there are many Jews imprisoned in Vught, there was at one time that Westerbork was so full that the Germans decided to also use Vught to imprison Jews until they could be deported. And in that May, when he is being transferred from Westerbork to Vught, in that very same month, there are 4 trains that took more than 4,000, almost 4,000 people from Vught to Westerbork, and they would then be immediately deported to Sobibor. In fact, in the months of May and June, from Vught to Westerbork, 12,000 people are deported. And here he is in Westerbork by himself going the other direction. I was in the archives in Amsterdam, and I was interested in finding out if there were trains going from Westerbork to Vught, because I couldn't figure out how he got there, because everybody, you know, when people would be moved, there would be trains, and as you can see, the trains would be listed. There are trains, so many trains that are of Jews deported from Amsterdam and other cities to Vught. There was a time that that Vught was being used to house Jews until they could be deported to Westerbork. But Jews going to Westerbork, there are only, as you can see, 310 to 313, 4 trains in all of this period. There's one on February 1943 when Vught just opened as a prison camp, and they thought, well, let's put Jews there, and because Westerbork was so full, and so a huge trainload of people from Amsterdam, where everybody who had to be was now forced to live. A huge train from Amsterdam went to Vught on the 20th of February. Then on the 4th of June, there were a small group of diamond workers, because Vught was going to be the place where they were going to have a diamond workshop, because the Germans needed people who could work with diamonds. And of course, there were a lot of Jews in Amsterdam who had the skills to do that. It was a very important occupation. And then on the 2nd of October, there's Mr. Walter Elias, who will play a huge role in the life of Lucky Klerenkoper. A total coincidence. I saw this in the archives, that here is Mr. Elias. His name is listed, his wife's name is not, his children's names are not, and then 3 other couples, and also they're not listed. And that's very odd, because everybody's name is always listed on these lists of people. And then in March 1944, there's another train that goes from Westerbork to Vught with some people that work for Philips. But very soon they are also going back again to Westerbork, and then they go to Auschwitz. So it is very odd that we have him traveling from Westerbork to Vught. And so I looked at some books that are written by people that were in Vught, in Westerbork at the time. Etty Hillison wrote letters. She was in Westerbork for a long time. She wrote letters to friends and would describe the things that happened. Philip Mechanicus is a fantastic journalist. He was imprisoned in Vught and managed to stay there for 9 months and kept detailed records of what was going on as a real journalist, smuggled it out. So this book, Waiting for Death, is really a gold mine of information about Westerbork. Neither book mentions anyone going from Westerbork to Vught. So how is this possible that Luc Klerenkoper, instead of being sent to Sobibor, manages to go to Vught? So maybe the letters will give us an indication. Here are the 4 letters. Number 1, it's the second page of number 1, 2, 3, and then the last one from February 1944, and this little card. So that's all we have. In his first letter that he writes, so he is moved to from Westerbork to Vught in May. In June, he finally writes to his aunt, and he asks her to renew his subscriptions to certain magazines, and all those magazines have to do with radio. One of them is called Radio Express, another one is called Radio something else. But anyway, please renew my subscriptions, and this one needs to be paid, and he sends her the address. In other words, he has a sense that he's going to be there for a while, that he is stable, that this is now his new house. In the second letter, that is July 13, he writes, Dear Trine and Leo, these are his aunt and uncle. Here, everything is in order, so you don't need to worry about me. And the next sentence is a horrific sentence. He writes, on July the 8th, I received a postcard from Mother from Westerbork that she wrote the Monday before their departure on Tuesday. So on July 28th or something, his parents and his sister were taken from Westerbork straight to Sobibor. By the time he gets that letter, they have long been dead. And he knows what this means. Of course, nobody had heard of Sobibor. Nobody knew that anyone was going to be killed right away. But people knew that they were going to have horrible time, that they would be working in difficult situations. It would be a very scary place to be. But of course, now we call it Sobibor. Now we know where it is. But anyway, he knows his mother and his father and his sister have left the Netherlands. His next sentence. At the moment, I am working in my profession. I don't know how many Jewish young men would be able to say that at this point in the history of the Holocaust, in this point of that huge number of people that are being exterminated in Sobibor. He said, I am working on my own profession. And he says also, I've moved again. Probably for the last time. In other words, now I will be here permanently. Who had that kind of feeling at that time? Did you pay the newspaper? He gets a newspaper. Did you send a forwarding address to my professional journals? Only the subscription of Radio Express has to be renewed. Because of my work, I'm studying a little. Dearest one, please greet all my friends and acquaintances and many kisses for you from Luke. How many people would be able to say, because of my work, I'm studying a little again? So there is something absolutely different and unique about him. So what happened in Vught? So we've seen he was in Westerbork, he now is in Vught. Vught is also in an area, Vught is right here, where there is nothing. It's a very secluded area. The camp here is behind forests. The village is somewhere over here, so nobody in the village would see what was going on in this camp. It started in January 1943 in the horrible cold, and it was a prison camp, not for Jews, but for homosexuals, gypsies, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, and then in February they decided to also put a lot of Jews in that prison camp. It was a horrible camp. It was the only camp outside of Germany that was run by the SS. And the SS commanders of the camp were all trained in Mauthausen and Sachsenhausen, which were horrific camps in Germany. So the treatment of the prisoners was awful in this camp. Now, when I say they all worked in industries, textile, diamond, and electronics, there was a huge electronic industry factory there, run by Philips, but Philips did not want any Jews. So there were no Jews working for Philips, but there were lots of Jews in textile and, of course, in diamond. When he got there in May 1943, it held 9,000 prisoners, and it was terribly overcrowded. They probably had to sleep 3 in a bed. So in June 1943, Philips decides to have admit Jews. There is a book written in 2003. Finally, a book came out that analyzes the role of Philips in the whole process of having prison camps, a prison camp run by the SS, Philips using slave labor. And then, of course, the issue of Philips not wanting Jews, and then at a certain point, they do want Jews. And let me just go back here. The explanation that this book gives is that there were prisoners, leaders of the prison camp, not Jewish prisoners, but other prisoners who watched a huge number of people being loaded on the train in May and in June. As I mentioned, about 12,000 people in total, almost 12,000 people in total, on these 4 trains. And they said to each other, watching that, we need to do something about this. And they went to the leaders of the managers of Philips, and they said, can't you organize that we can also get Jews and have a safe place where we can maintain some Jewish prisoners, rather than seeing all these people in these horrific situations on these trains. Children were, there was a trainload full of children that is still one of the worst moments in the Holocaust in the Netherlands. Anyway, so they talked to the commander, and they decided, they managed to convince Philips to admit Jews, and the commander of the camp agreed. And so there's another book written in 2012. It's a book. David Koker was this young man. He was a prisoner and kept a diary in the camp and smuggled it out. And he was a Jewish prisoner, and of course he was not in Philips, but he noticed that in June Philips was trying to include some Jewish people, and so he decided to see if he couldn't get into that group of people. He became what you would call a functionary. He helped select other prisoners, other Jewish prisoners, to become part of the Philips Commando. There is nothing in either one of these books that says that anybody was brought in from the outside. The emphasis that the Professor Klein, who wrote the first book, he emphasized how ridiculous it was that Philips waited to include Jewish people after all these trainloads full of people had left. There were so few Jews left. And so there's this criticism that Klein makes of Philips. David Koker is a very beautifully written book that is, of course, very helpful to me in understanding what Luc Claire-Koper went through. But the point I want to make is that David Koker was one of the people picking out people to be part of the Philips Commando, and that was only for people who were already there. So that makes absolutely no sense. We see him being in Westerbork and not being sent to Sobibor. We see him working in his own field, and then we also notice that here the Philips Commando has started based on the pity that the prisoners felt for all the Jews being moved away, and that they wanted to give a safe place for Jewish prisoners. So this is what the conclusion of the book is. According to this book, Philips Electronics decided to accept Jews after the horrific transports of thousands of Jews from Vught to Westerbork in May and June in 1943. And this is a direct quote. Thus, it was due to the understanding, courage, and ingenuity of the Philips people, that means these prisoners that worked for Philips, that the first of the Jews would receive the opportunity to enter the Philips Commando in June 1943. And I want to place our little change of address within this context, because he is already in Vught and he's already been selected to work in the Philips Commando way before any of this. So there is something very odd about this whole situation. How do we solve it? And thanks to Raymond Schultz, the scholar from the Netherlands, he pointed out. Actually, no, he did not point out. Let me put it this way. You want to know information about your family. So you write to the International Tracing Service, or you write to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Institute. And there they have copies of what is called the Cartothek, the card system, the card catalog. Because between October 20th, 1941 and August 27, 1942, in that period, the Jewish Council in Amsterdam completed one registration card for every Jewish person in the Netherlands on the order of the central office of security, that is the office whose only goal was to annihilate the Jewish people from the Netherlands. And so they had they ordered the Jewish council to make one card for each individual, so that with that card system, they would know where everybody was, and they could easily deport people. They would know exactly where people were, and people had absolutely no way of escaping. So these cards are actually, in terms of their function, their function is to murder. For us now, they have a completely different function. They actually give us information about the person, and they actually humanize the individual, the name, and so forth, gives us more information. So this is what the card looks for Lucky. So here is his name, the name of the person that typed this up, his address, he is Dutch, his father's name, and then his mother and his sister's name apparently are written in later. It says, geen godsdienst, he had no religion. He was, and here this would be just an automatic little entry that says that you would get an excuse from deportation because many people would have temporary excuses from deportation. And then some general remarks, for example, if somebody stole something or if somebody tried to escape, all of this would be recorded here. On the other side, this is his number. Here is the date that he arrives in Westerbork. That is on the 13th of April. He arrives in Westerbork. I'm not sure what this is, I've forgotten. But anyway, he goes then on the 17th of May to Vught. And then he goes from Vught back to Westerbork in March the 21st in 1944. So that's all on that card. Then after the war, this is written on the card, that he's died in Monowitz and that the address of his grandmother is here. Of course, the grandmother is also of course, killed. And here is another little notice that he died in Monowitz. Here's another little notice that he's dead. This red, it means that he was on the train on the 23rd of March, 1944, went out of Holland. That is written after the war by the Red Cross. No one knew when anybody left. Nobody knew. So you would be in Westerbork, people would know that your family in Amsterdam may know that you were picked up that night, but then after that, they never heard anything again until after the war, until these lists of people came out. So his aunt never knew what happened to him after he left Vught. Here he left, he left Vught here. She never knew what happened to him afterwards, until after the war. So these pieces of paper now are actually traces of murder, but they're also shadows of fate and remembrances of a person. So they have gained a tremendous amount of meaning to us. And these are the 3 cards that were made that record the process that he went through in Westerbork to be selected to go to the Philips Commando in Vught. And so I want to concentrate on these cards. These cards I received from the International Tracing Service, but they absolutely meant nothing to me. They were full of scribbles, full of abbreviations. And so I asked this Mr. Schultz in the Netherlands to help me with a word, and he says, oh, this will take me a while. And I thought, why would that take a while? Well, he actually went through them and described in detail what every entry in those on those cards are, and that is really very interesting and very complicated. So before I go on, I just want to let you know my relationship to Lucky. Here is the sister of my father, Co van Neck, and here is her husband, to be. He is her fiancé, Herman Klerenkoper, and his father and mother, his Trien, his oldest sister who will survive the war, and her husband. And here is Gerrit Klerenkoper, Kaatje Klerenkoper, Ellie Klerenkoper. These are his parents, his sister. His father was very famous. He was the coach of the women's athletic team, and they won the gold in the 1928 Olympics. So when this picture is taken, he has met the Queen. He is very famous, and he has just started a program on the radio to teach morning gymnastics. At 7 o'clock, the news. 15 minutes before 7, you can hear his voice. You could hear his voice, and then 15 minutes after the news. So all of the Netherlands knew his voice, and people still go to his house every year when they commemorate the people who were killed in the Holocaust in Amsterdam. So this is his youngest. This is my uncle's youngest sister. So this is the family of Luc. And this is how I relate. This is my aunt and uncle. And then this is also, I was very close to Trien as well. Let me just go back. Herman and Co go to Brazil in the 30s because there is no work in the Netherlands. And so they go to Brazil. They have their children, Koos and Kati, there. And then after the war, they go to the United States, Canada. And in 1999, my aunt dies. And in 2005, my uncle dies. When he dies, he leaves a little note. And that says, all but Trien and Leo on their way to the German gas chambers. Preserve this so it may not be forgotten. In this package were 20 letters. 7 letters written by Trien to Herman in Brazil, telling him that the family was no longer there, that they had all been murdered, and describing the terrible years that they had, that she had in the war. Her husband was not Jewish, and that is how she survived. She was arrested 3 times, but he was able to get her out all 3 times. Father, mother, all of these people, all of them are sent to Sobibor and murdered. There's also one letter written by Gerrit, and on the way to the train in Amsterdam, or on the way to the train in Westerbork, or when they would be pushed in the train on to Sobibor, they would drop cards from the train, letting Trien know what was happening. There's also one letter by Gerrit about the youngest sister, Mina, and her husband. They committed suicide on the day that the Germans invaded the Netherlands, or the day that the Dutch capitulated on the 14th, 15th of May. So they were already dead with their children. That little package, my uncle decided, requested from his daughter, Kati, to be deposited at the Institute, the Netherlands Institute of War Documentation, that is in this huge building where they have miles of documentation of the Second World War. And anyone can read these letters, these 20 letters in this building. You can also read them online. So that's where I read them and then decided to translate them. So here are those letters. And if we set them within the historical context of that period, we first of all set them within the family circle. And if you look at this picture, the one that's missing is Luc. And I think it's Luc taking the picture. And I think he was probably 8 or 9 years old, very precocious, and everybody's laughing at him. That's what I think is happening. And so what we need to do is gain from their faces, infer from their faces what kind of person he was. And that is what we have to do from those pieces of paper too. We have no photographs, we just have a few pieces of paper. Draw from those what kind of person he was. And when he writes these letters to Trien, there's something very interesting. He and also his sister wrote an amazing, a long letter that goes on and on and on from Westerbork to her Trien, and both she and her brother Luc, they both do not call their aunt and uncle Aunt Trien and Uncle Leo like all Dutch properly raised children do. They use the aunt or uncle in front of it. They call them by their first name. Not only that, they call her Trieneman, and the Ellie calls him Lillo. In other words, they have such intimate, friendly relationships. I think they actually are raised in a very modern way, in that all of these hierarchical expressions are rejected, and they are very, very close. So it's a very close family. Luke, in every letter that he writes, says to his aunt, say hello to so-and-so, and thank so-and-so for the letter, and thank so-and-so for the package. Apparently, he is a very social person that had a whole lot of friends around him. The one person that he refers to in every one of the 4 letters is Annie. And Annie apparently writes to him, and Annie visits Strien, and Annie sends him packages. So Annie must be, I assume, I have not been able to verify this, must have been his girlfriend, and must not have been Jewish, because otherwise she would not be alive. So all these people that he mentions in those letters, the same names over and over, I assume they're all friends that were not Jewish and that were helping her, his aunt, and must have helped him also beforehand. So now I want to focus on Luke in Westerbork, how in that period in Westerbork he manages to get that exemption to go to Vught rather than to be murdered within 3 days. And this is a picture of Westerbork. So to do that, we have to place Westerbork and that whole Holocaust in the Netherlands, how that went within a little earlier historical situation. In 1941, in February, there was a fight in a restaurant where some Jewish people were performing, and Nazis came in and tried to attack it and create trouble, and one of the Nazis, a few days later, died. And so as a reprisal, the Germans collected 400 Jewish men, young men, just from the street, and took to Mauthausen. And that is actually only time, very early, before deportation started, that people actually knew what happened to their loved one. In other words, they sent the ashes back, they sent the clothes back, they let people know that your son was not only killed in Mauthausen, he was tortured in Mauthausen. They established, the Nazis established a Jewish council. They wanted the Jews to keep order. And so the Jewish council was tasked with keeping order because there was a big strike, because these young men were picked up in the middle of the day. Everybody could see that, and then they were sent to Mauthausen and murdered. So there was a strike in Holland of all dock workers and all kinds of workers. And so the Nazi government said to the Jewish council, if you don't stop the strike, we will pick up another 400 young men and send it to Mauthausen. So at that point, the Jewish council became part of the whole process by which the Nazis suppressed and then killed Jews. In June, again, 300 young high school students were deported to Mauthausen, and no one survived. And so Mauthausen became that horrific threat. The name of Mauthausen gained an almost magical power synonymous with an unknown but gruesome death, and that is Jacques Presser, who wrote the historical work on the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And he says, his paragraph goes on, and he says, Mauthausen was much worse than we could have imagined. So this is what then happens. The Jewish Council has a weekly. It's called the Joodse Weekblad, Jewish Weekly. And here is an extra edition. The deportations have started. This is, the date is August 7, 1942. The deportation started in July, and people weren't coming in. So the German rulers would send people a notice and saying, you have to come in because you're going to be taken to Westerbork. And people wouldn't show up. So what they did is they said, if Jews do not immediately obey the oproep, the call up for, and that's a euphemism for work in Germany, they will be imprisoned and sent to Mauthausen. So if you got your notice that you were supposed to go to Westerbork, it would be better to go to Westerbork and then be sent to Germany somewhere and be in a horrible work camp, because if you didn't, you'd be sent to Mauthausen, and that was torture and certain death. the next point, all the Jews who do not wear the Jewish star will be sent to Mauthausen. And then the third one is the most powerful one, and that is those Jews that change their their address without notifying the authorities will be arrested and sent to Mauthausen. In other words, if you would go underground and they would find you, your punishment was Mauthausen. And so when Trien writes to Hermann after the war that the whole family has been picked up and nobody went into hiding, she says they didn't go into hiding because they were afraid. And that fear is Mauthausen. So that fear of, this is what you have to remember, that Luke lived with that fear, that everybody lived with that fear. If you in any way violated any of the rules, you had a chance to be sent to Mauthausen. So while Luke is in Westerbork, he would see these transports and he would see how people were treated in these trains. So these transport, as Philip Mechanicus says, these transport arouse absolute disgust. They use cattle cars made for transporting horses. The deported do not sit even on straw, but right on the bare floor among the bags with food and their few belonging, and the trains are old and filthy. So this is the last card written by the grandparents of Luke, who are deported on the very day that Luke arrives in Westerbork. And this is what the father writes, and you can see he has beautiful handwriting, and of course he wrote this sitting in that cattle car on the floor. He says, "Dear family, dear children and grandchildren, it's impossible to give a description of the journey because there are no windows in the car." That's what he writes up here, upside down. "We have received everything in the letter from Gerrit today, just before nightfall. I have everything that you ask about in my possessions, the pipe as well as tobacco. This is at the same time the notice of our departure for Poland. Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. received the notice in bed, and I spoke to Bram, that is his son-in-law, said farewell. Gerrit's attempts for us have failed. Gerrit tried to get him out, get some kind of a postponement. Let's hope that he will be more successful for himself and his family, because, and these are the last words from the grandfather, this is hell, indescribable beastliness." Now, Luke was in Westerbork, and the first letter that Luke writes to Trien begins with a sentence in which he says, "I heard that they went." And of course, we know that he meant Westerbork, but it was a censored letter, so he couldn't say that. And then he says, "I had hoped that they would talk to Tante Griet." And Tante Griet went underground. And so he's saying, in other words, I have seen this now, and I wish that my parents would go underground. I wish I could have been going underground. So between May 18 and June 29, a very short period of time, Trien receives all these note cards from all these people, and they're all killed in Sobibor. So after the war, Trien writes to Hermann a long letter describing who was taken when. And so now she describes that Luki was sent to Vught, a concentration camp where he remained until the next year, March 44, which is, of course, not true. Luki was sent to Westerbork, and from Westerbork he went to Vught. And it is such an unusual journey that she does not remember that, because it is so odd. She remembers he was in Vught, and of course you're sent to Vught, but instead something happened that Luki managed in Westerbork. So here are 5 cards of the card collection that the Jewish Council kept in Westerbork that documents the procedure by which Luke Kleokoper gained an exemption for Vught. And this is, of course, that number of the train again that's written after the war, but here is his name. Here are various dates when things happened. And this is card number 1. This is the back of card number 1. People are very careful with paper, so that's written on the back. And these are little 3x5 cards. So you can imagine how tiny that writing is. And then this is the last card. So this is number 3. This is the back of number 1. And so let's read these cards to see how it happened. So he arrives on the 13th, and Mr. Kindler, who works for the Jewish Council, and he himself, I looked this up, is going to be killed in Auschwitz himself later. But at the moment, he has an exemption from deportation because he works for the Jewish Council in Westerbork. And he says there's a letter from a certain place, but then there's also a getuigschrift, a letter of recommendation, as electrotechnicus, electromechanic, written by Dr. Biederman, who is a teacher in electrotechnique. So apparently, there he brought with him a letter of recommendation by this Dr. Biederman, and that he can do something special, that he is an electromechanical person. And so, who is Mr. Biederman? And Mr. Biederman is a very scholarly person. He wrote a dissertation on quantum mechanics. He was graduated cum laude, and apparently when Jewish students no longer could go to the university, he must have been the one that gave private lessons to Luc. So that Luc was trained by this Dr. Biederman. And then there is the next date, 16th of April. Elias needs him as electromechanic for Vught. This is the 16th of April. He is needed to be sent to Vught, where the Philips company is, which at this time is not taking Jews, not till June. And Elias already has determined that this person cannot go to Sobibor, needs to be part of the electrical industry of. And here is, I have to kind of go quickly, there's a letter that I couldn't find anything about Mr. Elias. Who is Mr. Elias that he has this power? But then I found a letter in a totally different situation that he is actually just being appointed by the head of the security in the Netherlands, the one whose only goal was to eliminate all Jews from this earth. He appointed Elias to find Jewish people to be sent to Vught to be part of Philips Electronics. There is another very interesting piece of paper that I found in the that I will quickly summarize rather than read, and that this is Laman Tripp is the manager of the Philips Commando. He did not want Jews. After the war, he says it was a total mistake we took Jews. But here he's talking about having been called by the Nazi commander of the camp that the Jewish council, that is Mr. Elias, who's now working there in Vught, is bringing things on the black market, and that we will get them too. So the Jewish council is providing things on the black market for Philips company, and therefore now Philips is willing to take these Jews. So here is another page, and that is Mr. Elias will request from Hauptsturmführer Austerfunten a transfer to Vught. There is a special permission he has to ask to get this guy, this Luc, from Westerbork to go to Vught. And who is Austerfunten? He is, of all the German war criminals in the Netherlands, he was among those most directly responsible for the mass murder of Dutch Jewry. And so he worked for Willy Lages, and their goal was the complete eradication of the Jews. This man had to give permission for Luc to be sent to Vught. So then letters get lost, there are lots of problems. So finally, on May the 3rd and May the 4th, the Central Stelle, the office of Austerfunten, sends first a telegram and a telex to make sure that Luc does not get on the train to Sobibor, but gets to Vught. And here, this is the final one. He will depart with their very next transport to Vught. And now he is part of the Philips company. And so what we now have seen is that the explanation in this book that says people were so moved by these huge departures, these huge deportations in May and June, and then convinced Philips to admit Jews is totally wrong. It is based on the recollection of people who survived and said, yes, I remember we saw these horrible trainloads, and then we went to Phillips and said, why can't we have some Jews? When you look at the cards, all of this was decided on a much different level, and that is the level of Berlin and the level of Lages, the central office, the man in charge, because Germany was terribly short on manpower, needed to win the war, and needed highly skilled, highly trained technicians. And so apparently they decided to also in the Netherlands find some people that were highly skilled, Jewish people that were highly skilled, and then would be temporarily put in these labor camps, work for Philips, because Philips was, of course, run by the Germans. Philips made things for the German government to win the war. So you can see the incredible contrast between, on the one hand, that they wanted to, the Nazis wanted to eradicate all the Jews, and on the other hand, they wanted to win the war. And you can see that very story played out in the life of Lucky Kleerkoper. And now, looking at the little innocuous change of address, we now see that a lot was accomplished in Westerbork. Of course, it is so terribly sad that his brilliance led him to Vught and ultimately to Auschwitz, and he was killed there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy if you have any questions.
My question is about his aunts.
About what?
About his aunts that he wrote to all the time. Didn't his letters to her put her life in jeopardy?
No, because, well, this is very interesting. There was a period that the Nazis were not sure what they were going to do with people who were in mixed marriages. And then for certain days they said we have to round them up, and other days they said we don't. And then at a certain point they decided, and she was actually among the very first people that were arrested. On the very first day she was rounded up and had to walk in circles for 3 days. It was horrible. Together with Jacques Presser, for those of you who know Jacques Presser, he describes it in his book what actually happens. She was arrested twice more, but then at a point they decided that people in mixed marriages, if they were old enough and did not have children, they could stay. Or, if they were not old enough and could still have children, if they were willing to be sterilized, they could stay. So I assume that she had a permit, or whatever that was, a sperre, an exemption from deportation, and was at a certain point completely safe. But for a long time she was not.
What work has been done on this German effort to use Jewish talent? Because obviously they were shipping at the same time this one guy got out, they were shipping all sorts of other people that they could have used in the war effort and chose not to.
It was totally illogical. That's one of the things that book says. Also, there were all these Jewish scholars, Jewish engineers and so forth on these trains being killed, and it was a contradiction that you have in the war effort, that the Germans wanted to win the war, but at the same time they hated the Jews and wanted to kill all the Jews. And so you can see that in this story. There's a book that just was published last year called KL, a concentration camp, by Waxman, and he writes about this contradiction. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is the thought that at a certain point Phillips did not need Luke anymore, and that's when he was shipped out?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. What happened? Phillips was, of course, run by the Germans and had to do what the Germans said. And the commander decided that he wanted to get rid of all the Jews in the camp. And there was this other, there are always various layers. In 1944, March 1944, when the Jews were sent to Westerbork, this was also the period that the southern part of Holland was just about to be liberated. And so the Germans did almost, they evacuated the Jews to Germany because they wanted to use them. And so when Luc was moved to Auschwitz, he was placed in another place where he was used as an electrician. And all of these people from Philips were placed in places where they built anti-aircraft tanks or whatever, all kinds of things in the war effort. Yes, they were. So they were needed in Germany, and they were afraid that Holland would be liberated. So they wanted to move them out. Yeah.
What is your plan to do with the research from here?
Well, what I'm planning to do is to put something on paper as soon as I can and be finished with it so I can do something else again. It's very time-consuming, but it's been absolutely so satisfying, especially since I had this help from Raymond Schultz reading those cards. He knew exactly. He was the one that worked for years as an archivist for the Red Cross, making order in these thousands and thousands of cards, because when I went to the archives in Amsterdam, I found so many more cards on Luc. I couldn't copy them, but there's so many more cards on everybody. And so, yeah, thank you for the question.
Is this one person you're going to really focus on, or are you going to follow more of the tree?
Well, what I've done is, for the family, I have translated all the letters and I've placed them within a historical context. So, beginning with 1940, with the grandkids in mind who know nothing. And so when they read these letters, then they know what the family went through. But now that I've seen this amazing story about Lucky, I kind of would like to have something written about him. Because I think he is, it's so incredibly sad. It's sad. Ellie, his younger sister, writes this incredible letter. She is a year older than Anne Frank. She's in the same school as Anne Frank. Gerard Klerenkoper teaches phys ed at the school where Anne Frank went. The other two cousins are also at that school, and Anne teaches math at that school. So Ellie writes this incredible long letter. She's there for days, and she describes all the crazy stuff that she sees around her. And I first thought, oh, I wish I could do something with it. But, I can't find anything on her. It's all gone. There's this one picture. My uncle knew nothing about any of this at all, about what happened to Luc. And the interesting thing is that this one little story about Luc that my cousin Cathy in Canada remembers about Luc, and that is that her father told her that when Luc was very young, her father taught him how to build radios. And her father was 15 in 1925 when he built his first radio. So her father, my Uncle Herman, was crazy about building radios. He built a radio for my aunt when they were engaged. In this early time, nobody had radios. People built their own radios. And so Lucky must have been 7 or 8 when this happened, because after that my uncle goes to Brazil. So my cousin Cathy thinks that had my uncle known what happened to Luc in terms of at a moment in his life, he felt appreciated. He felt that he was studying a little. I'm working in my own field. He had recognition in the world of radio, and may have given my uncle some consolation, living with this terrible loss and not knowing any of the stories about his family at all.
Did the ones who went to Brazil, were they 2 brothers?
No, my uncle only.
One uncle went to Brazil.
So Luc's father, Gerrit, had a brother, Herman, and that's my uncle. He married my father's sister, and they went to Brazil.
I see. And that's where the whole family now comes from that branch.
Exactly.
Just from him.
Exactly. That cousin, those two cousins, Kathy and Koos, she lives in Canada, he lives in Texas. They are the only ones that have survived from that whole family. Yes.
I see.
Yes.
Thank
And
you.
Koos's grandson is called Gerrit, after Gerrit Klerenkoper. And actually the father's middle name is Gerrit. There's a lot of Gerrits in the Klerenkopers family. And that name continues, yes.
And did Trine never had children?
No, Trine never had children. She was born in 1895, so she was past the childbearing age. She married someone who had children, was his second marriage. She had no children. She, after the war, went to my uncle and lived with them she and her husband went to my uncle in Canada, and they lived there. She was a brilliant woman. She was very artistic. She worked in the diamond business, making sharpening diamonds or whatever you call that. You don't call it sharpening, you call it something else. Anyway, she was very artistic and worked for Harvard for a while in their gem department, whatever technical term that is. Yes. And then but she was always very close to my uncle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Oh, thank you all so very much for your attention. It's just been wonderful to be able to share this with you.
Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you in May. And thank you, Hilda.